let's just jump right into this explainer. Look, I'm guessing most of you probably think you've got a pretty solid grasp on global agriculture, right? You stroll into the grocery store, grab your standard produce, and just assume the crops we rely on today are the absolute best nature has to offer. Well, what if I told you that one of the most resilient, nutritionally perfect plants on Earth has been basically ignored by modern trade? We really need to talk about this, because this one crop is going to challenge everything you think you know about survival.
So, be honest. Do you think the modern peanut is the only nut that grows underground? If you're nodding yes right now, well, you're definitely not alone, but you're also wrong. There's actually an indigenous African species that puts our pampered commercial peanut to absolute shame. It's infinitely hardier, it's vastly more protein-packed, and it natively thrives in a region stretching from Senegal to Liberia, an area historically known as the Upper Guinea Coast. Long before our modern global trade network dictated exactly what you should be eating, this foundational crop sustained millions of people through some of the absolute darkest eras of human history.
To really grasp why this plant is such a total powerhouse, we have to talk about a concept called geocarpy. Think of it as a biological glitch. See, most plants in nature scatter their seeds through the wind or, they rely on animals, but not the bambara groundnut. After its flowers are pollinated up above ground, the stems literally elongate and physically bury their own developing fruit right back down into the dirt. It's kind of like an ostrich, right? It gets pollinated and then shoves its own offspring headfirst into the soil to hide it from the brutal, scorching sun of the savanna. It literally plants its own seeds. When you compare modern agriculture to this plant's biology, the difference is honestly kind of laughable. Modern commercial crops are, let's face it, pampered divas. They demand perfectly loose, highly fertile dirt, expensive fertilizers, and just constant, meticulous care. But the bambara groundnut? That thing is a hardcore survivalist. It actively thrives in what scientists literally call trash soil. We are talking highly degraded, toxic, and incredibly nutrient-poor dirt where pretty much every other commercial plant just completely fails. It is a drought-dodging evolutionary marvel that just doesn't need our coddling.
And its biological makeup proves exactly why it's so important. You probably assume you need a highly complex, highly varied diet to survive, right? Well, the bambara groundnut is basically a biological MRE, a complete meal ready to eat. Unlike a potato that mostly just hands you a bunch of carbs, a single seed of this groundnut contains an almost perfect, self-contained balance of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. It can sustain human life entirely on its own during severe food shortages. So, quick question for you to think about. If you could only grow one crop to survive a global food crisis, are you really going to choose a potato, or would you choose the groundnut that hands you a complete meal in a single bite?
Now, unfortunately, because of that incredible nutritional density, this plant was thrust into a truly grim reality. For 300 years, this indigenous Upper Guinea staple was actively exploited as a primary provision to sustain human life during the transatlantic slave trade. We really can't talk about the biology of this incredible crop without confronting the devastating history it was dragged into.
The bambara groundnut, or if you want to get scientific, Vigna subterranea, became a critical logistical support pillar for the absolute darkest trade in human history. Slave ship captains deliberately targeted and bought these specific groundnuts in massive bulk quantities, and it was a totally cold, calculated move. They figured out that feeding captive Africans their familiar, traditional diets dramatically improved their chances of physically surviving the horrific crossing of the Middle Passage.
And once those ships reached the Americas, the reality on the ground was just as harsh. The typical diet provided by colonial plantation owners to enslaved people was deliberately monotonous and severely lacking in basic necessary nutrition. To fight back against this, enslaved Africans completely pioneered the cultivation of familiar dietary plants in their own personal spaces, which became known as dooryard gardens. The contrast here is staggering. You have the nutritionally bankrupt plantation rations on one hand, and these incredibly nutrient-dense, complete survival crops grown by the enslaved people on the other. So please understand this crucial point. These dooryard gardens were absolutely not some casual gardening hobby. Cultivating the bambara groundnut in the Americas relied entirely on enslaved Africans. They weren't growing this for export, and they definitely weren't growing it for plantation profit. Planting this specific crop was a desperate, calculated, everyday survival tactic to stave off literal starvation. But beyond just keeping themselves physically alive, it was also a profound act of cultural preservation. They were keeping a vital piece of their Upper Guinea heritage alive right there in the dirt of a new world.
Now, initially, because of intense social and racial prejudice, plantation owners completely looked down on these African introductions. They just wrote them off as slave food. But over time, something interesting happened.
These ingredients slowly infiltrated the plantation owners' diets through the dishes prepared by enslaved cooks. Despite the deep-seated prejudice of the time, this complete meal superfood secretly crossed the threshold into the plantation house, and it eventually evolved into the foundational culinary signatures of the Americas.
So you have to ask yourself, if this was an indestructible, nutritionally perfect superfood that literally became a culinary staple, why on earth isn't it on every single grocery store shelf today? Well, here's the historical rug pull for you. The Bambara groundnut was simply replaced on a global scale by the South American peanut. And no, not because the South American peanut is nutritionally better, because it isn't. Not because it's better for the soil, it's definitely not. It replaced it entirely because the South American peanut has softer shells that are just a little bit easier for modern factories to crack open industrially. We literally traded a drought-proof survival crop for a weaker peanut purely for industrial convenience.
But today, the world is finally waking up to that mistake, and scientists are basically scrambling to bring the Bambara groundnut back into the spotlight. Framing this discarded survival crop as a climate change miracle is honestly not an exaggeration. Because of its geocarpy glitch, that built-in evolutionary shield against extreme savanna heat, it requires almost zero water to grow. Plus, planting it actually heals dead, degraded soil instead of stripping it bare. It is the ultimate drought-proof solution for future global food security on our rapidly warming planet.
Think about the entire journey here. We took a plant that fed millions natively, exploited it to sustain the darkest trade in human history, relegated it to desperate survival gardens, and then completely tossed it aside just because a different peanut was a tiny bit easier for a factory machine to shell. And yet, after all of that, we are now looking at this forgotten, drought-proof complete meal superfood as the literal savior for a warming planet. So a crop that buries its own seeds to survive the heat is now the key to our future?